Excellent. So we'll start from the very beginning here. So also in the same doc, and make sure for people who just came, I'll share that link again in the chat. As a reminder, we're working in a notes document, and we'll be using that for questions and for some of the breakout rooms today. So towards the top, there's a section on your experience. So I want to take just 10 minutes just to kind of get our brains going here. And if you can go down to the list on the doc and think about a time that you collaborated on an open project and everything was perfect. Everything went just the way you wanted, or almost just the way you wanted. So in that case, what happened there? What made that collaboration work well? And on the other hand, think of a time that you collaborated on an open project and it was a complete train wreck. What happened there and what made it a train wreck? So we'll take just 10 minutes or so here, and I'll share my screen just to have that up here while we're going through it. And just go ahead and fill in on this part of the doc, just any experiences you've had, either where things went really well or when things were the total opposite. So we'll pause here and then we'll pick up in about 5-10 minutes or so. So just looking through some of the responses here, we have people that wrote about, I wrote about communication, just because that's always something I've seen when you have people going in one direction, but not knowing how the other people are going. Another comment on teamwork, about that being really important for working together and solving conflicts effectively and not having turnover. Having tools that sharing common tools and platforms so people can see what other people are doing, and it's easier to be connected to other people's work. And then when things didn't go so well, we had things like lack of role clarity, where people didn't really understand what other people were doing on the team, and it causes a breakdown in communication and workflow. Again, communication where those common goals aren't as clear. And I see a couple more squeezing their way in here too. Purpose, so when things went really well, everyone knew what they were doing and the meaning behind it. Lightweight goals. These are all great examples here. So this is a good segue for us to start thinking about today on really thinking like, what is open source? When we say open source, what does that mean? And what are some of the advantages and benefits that come along with open source? So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the first part of the presentation component here and talk a little bit on just a very high level intro on what is open source and what are some of the advantages for working as an open source project. So I'm going to share, I'm already sharing my screen, so I'm just going to jump right into the slideshow for today. Let me, oops. I have to change the screen share. Okay. So one more time. Just make this full screen. Great. Okay. So the journey begins. So one thing you're going to hear me say a lot over the next couple of months that we're working together. What is open source? Open source is a method. It's a way that we develop and distribute software, and it's a set of best practices that make software and content and help build teams that make these things. It's a movement. It's a movement that's based on ideals and philosophy that go beyond only code or content. And it's rooted in a belief that these things have an impact greater than any one of us, and that they have certain freedoms that should be protected as well. And finally, it's a culture. It's a collection of people and values and ideas that just happen to take the form of software projects, content, and communities. So across the rest of this session, we'll talk a little bit now about open source advantages in community. We'll look at, have a breakout room really quick on looking at what your open advantage is. Well, then we'll go into the origin story of open source, connect that to this, what's going on with digital public goods. And finally, with the rest of our time, we'll look at what sustainable business models actually look like for open source. So I introduced myself a little bit already, but just a little bit more context. I've been doing open source for about a third of my life and working in a number of different projects and communities of different sizes and different levels of, or different sizes for their project and their community. But since June of 2020, currently I'm with the Office of Innovation, and I work with startup companies like yourselves and provide open source guidance on technical assistance and support, collaboration, and some of the guidance that we'll be talking about both today and tomorrow. So we'll start from the very beginning. What is open source? Some definitions, if we take it from the Open Source Initiative's definition of open source, which we'll talk about in a little bit, you'll see this very general definition that there are some people who use the term open source because it really comes with these essential freedoms that, open source software or content is software or content that can be freely used, modified, and shared in any kind of form, modified or unmodified, by anyone. That's it. That's the simple definition, but obviously there's a little bit more to really understanding that. So one thing you'll often hear around open source projects is this acronym of FOSS, F-O-S-S. So this stands for free and open source software. And this means free as in speech, not necessarily free as in pizza or free as in beer. It means that the source code or the content is publicly available for reading, for reuse, and for modification. But FOSS is more than just software. Like I said, it also includes content, but it also includes things like development practices, licensing, communities, and all these things that help build software and people that share a set of common values. Now, in terms of where open source is today, it's really eating the world, which is a theme we'll have across this presentation today. You probably recognize maybe half the logos, maybe all the logos on this screen, from the White House to UNICEF to all these major tech services, from both open and closed source ones. They all use open source. It's really everywhere. It's in your pocket, it's in your room, it's on your computer, it's powering the internet, literally. This is a study from 2014 that looked at operating systems across the web and across public servers. And it found that about 80% of them were running a Linux-based operating system. And which is based on an open source, it's an open source operating system. And on top of that, you have all these other web technologies like Node.js, a web server, and development frameworks that fit inside of that too. So going to the point of being in your room, I'm sure you recognize Android and Firefox. Maybe you've heard of LibreOffice before. These are all other open source projects that are really well known and used in a variety of everyday use cases, but also in your programming and in your code. All these programming languages are also open source, from the Python project, which is managed by the Python Software Foundation, to Microsoft's .NET, which they fully open sourced a couple of years back, and even Apple's Swift, also an open source programming language. Interesting pattern to look at kind of the broad range of who is open sourcing or who's participating in here, from smaller nonprofits to some of these really big tech giants. But so why do people, we talked about what open source is, but why do people do it? What are the advantages? Usually you can summarize it to these four. There's probably more, but we'll focus on these four today. So the first one is on control. It's always possible to study and understand how something works, and nobody can tell you exactly what to do and how to use the software or the tool. It's also great for training, so that learning is happening in the public, and you get a connection to a wider ecosystem beyond some closed source work. You also get faster feedback. And then also we'll look at security, which I'll talk about more in a bit too, but generally it's easier to audit your software or your tool. And it's often quicker to fix problems just due to the nature of having more eyes on your work. And lastly, on stability, you can build on open common standards like the DPG standard that we'll talk about today. Working with standards also improves stability because it improves interoperability. Yeah, I might unmute there. The last one is on stability. It improves your interoperability, and it's easier to fork and continue on a project if it comes down to that. There's this term called Linus's law that given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. So we're going to talk really quickly now, change directions into what are the advantages that open source can provide for your project, and we'll look at what your open advantage can be, and this will lead us into the breakout rooms. So what are some of the benefits of open practices? I really love this framework of open practices that Mozilla and the Copenhagen Institute for Interaction Design put together a couple years back. And in their report, they summarize 3 key benefits of what open practices mean for your product and for your business model. Is that first, it allows you to offer better products and services. You get to lower your product development and operating costs, and you can increase market share. Let's look at some examples of each of these and break them down a little bit. So if we look at the better products and services piece, there's some really great examples of this that, it allows you to improve your products and services in a way that you can co-create or collaborate with a community. Local Motors really have this well-known online shared database of car parts and different components that people would use to actually design custom cars, and they could actually find different parts and understand like what other people were doing. And then also looking at the Lego project or Legos that you can get new ideas or offerings generated from your community. So Lego has their ideas platform that allows anyone to propose like a Lego kit and ideas of what to build. The community can vote on them, and then the top voted Lego kits get put into production. So for their community is Lego enthusiasts who have ideas or want to see new kinds of kits. If we switch and look at the second one, lowering product development and operating costs, again, one advantage here is increasing your access to talent from the open source community. Twitter is a really great example of this and how they expand their hiring pool with their open source programs. They find some of their top talent from people who are already engaging or interacting with their open source projects. So in this example, the community would be contributors who are already familiar with Twitter's open source tools or their dependencies, and it could be developers, designers, writers, and more. It can also allow you to share development and maintenance costs with contributors or with strategic partners. There's a really well-known version of this called the Llvm CLang toolchain. So if you're compiling software, you're writing things that are a little more low level on the system, you need a compiler that builds the code and lets you run it on the computer. So several different companies across the tech sector actually work on Llvm. I think it was Apple that actually started it. But there's a number of companies that all depend on it because it's a really huge part of the operating system software development lifecycle. So a lot of companies and groups participate and work with Llvm, and they get to share that development and maintenance costs for it as well. It's a common building block that they all need to do their own work. And lastly, you can also look at reducing support costs by having an active user community group. Mozilla is a really good example of this as well with their user support site. So volunteers can answer questions and they can write support articles. And the community that shows up for these kinds of things are usually Firefox users who support the Mozilla mission, and they're usually going to be writers or localizers or translators. Third and finally, we'll look at increasing market share. So you can also incentivize adoption by giving your products away for free. Google's Android is probably one of the best known examples of this, is that anyone can use Android as a development platform to create their own applications. And so their community ends up being Android application developers. And you can also facilitate compatibility by driving a standard. Kubernetes, which is a software orchestration tool, its adoption at scale creates informal de facto standardization around containers. So even though this is actually kind of starting to change, we're seeing more standardization on these kinds of things, but Kubernetes really has helped shape that environment around what standards are being formed by the essence of using their product. You have to follow certain design best practices or software engineering aspects. And their community is also their users, but also developers and DevOps type folks. So that's a quick look at these 3 different benefits of open practices. There may be one of these that stands out the most to you. There may be multiple of these that feel similar. There's no one size fits all here, but this is just to give you an idea of how open practices can impact your work. So now we're going to take a pause here on the presentation piece, and we're going to switch to breakout rooms. I'm going to have to set these up really quick, but we're going to go for about 10 or 15 minutes. We'll set you up with a breakout room for your company. And in these next 10 to 15 minutes, in the shared doc that we did the intros on and the little warm up earlier, in that same document, we'll go to the breakout rooms and just write together with your team, what do you think your open advantage is and the open source benefit for your company and your product? You know, with that advantage in mind, what does your community look like? What kind of people and backgrounds are you looking to bring in? And then think about who are your ideal contributors? So I'm going to, Zoom's bar here is, I'm going to stop my share and I'm going to set up some breakout rooms really quick. Actually, I'll pause the recording while we do that. But I see some really great stuff here, thinking about other open source projects you're using and really thinking about what those people look like and what kinds of activities do you see them doing. Before we move on ahead, I just want to see if anyone wants to vocalize any of the things you wrote down here or share it with the group. I'd love to hear a little bit more around your thinking on some of these.
Yeah, I can share. Can you hear me okay, Justin?
Perfectly.
Okay, great. This is video from Tilly. Yeah, I think one of the biggest advantages with open source is it reduces barriers to entry, to access, cutting edge technology, and it really makes it available to underserved communities in every country and region of the world, and in any language, culture, and setting, which I think is one of the biggest drivers and benefits of open source.
Access is a huge thing. And that's also, I think, a good part of what we'll talk about later on the digital public goods piece. I think that'll definitely be a good tie-in there. But yeah, that's a really strong benefit that you can get just by having your work being out there and sharing it in ways that it's more accessible and usable by other people. Those are all really key parts. Thanks for sharing. Anyone else before we jump ahead?
Yeah, me, Lou from Talk to You. On our end, I was thinking when you were talking about the Lego experience and the ideas things, and we are very focused on getting contributions from youth for the topics that we addressed and how we address them. So I was thinking, we don't have this still though, but this is something like that I was thinking it would be good for us to have a space where they can contribute the ideas, they can they can express their needs, so we can have a constant flow of feedback of their needs and prioritizing while they are voting what is the things that they want us to address, because that is going to give us like a better roadmap of what are the new interventions that we have to create for them specifically.
Absolutely.
And I'm Ravi from Tilly. We've built everything we're building is built on open source. I think it's been it really kind of equalizes some of the barriers of entry that Vidya mentioned earlier. And that's really helped us to get to a certain stage. But then as we keep extending our reach into the community validation is something that we would really cherish in this journey. And I think we're looking forward to engaging in the open source mechanisms that you put forward so that there's more visibility and transparency into how we're getting things done.
That makes sense. So tomorrow, one of the things we'll talk about is kind of what that journey looks like around like validation and building a community. That's one of the things we'll be talking a lot about during the mentorship around how you actually bring people into your project and how you set yourself up so people can participate or join in on the things you're doing. So in tomorrow's session, where we talk more about the logistics for the next 6 to 12 months, that'll be a huge part where we talk about building this open source house and how you try to build your house so you can bring people in. But that's a really great point too. Okay, so I think this, yeah, no, go ahead. There's someone else. I don't have video, so I'm just looking here.
I just thank you.
Oh, sure. Super. So we can go ahead and jump on into the rest of the presentation for today. So now we're going to go into the history of open source, and then we'll talk about a much more contemporary topic around digital public goods. So I'm just going to change my screen share here and go back to the presentation. Presenter view. Okay. So I'm just going to reshare now. Okay, can you see my screen again?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so now we'll talk again, going back to that part I mentioned earlier on a method, a movement, and culture. Let's talk a little bit on the origin story of how this open source stuff all began and how exactly we got to where we are today. I know history can be really dry, but I will try my best to make this really interesting and engaging. But we're going to go back to the very beginning of the free software movement, which started as we know it today in 1983. So there was this guy who worked at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in their media lab. His name was Richard Stallman. And he lived through a period of research as a faculty member there where open access to software was the default. That was the way we worked in the 1960s and the 70s because, well, we had all these different kinds of hardware and no one really cared about software. It wasn't that valuable. So the way people worked before then was people would just share software on floppy disks and CDs, or I don't know if CDs they had, but definitely floppy disk. You know, it was people were very willing. That was the culture around software, was to share and be open about this because people weren't as super interested in that part. So he ended up creating this belief that he had that software should protect the user and respect their rights, and that there were certain freedoms that every user of software should have. So he launched this project called the GNU Project, and that was his way of acting on those beliefs and those values. So this was the beginnings of an open source operating system. 2 years later, Richard Stallman would go on to found the Free Software Foundation in 1985, and this became the legal and operational home for the GNU operating system. But the FSF was also the first significant institution to protect and embrace free software. And while at the beginning, it was more software oriented, today the FSF advocates for many more parts of the free culture movement outside of just code. But in the beginning, that's how it started. If we will finally skip ahead to 1989, we see the first draft of the GNU public license, or GPL version 1. And while it technically wasn't the first open source license, it was the first of its kind. It is a kind of license called copyleft. And this marked a significant shift in perspective on the way that software is developed and how we distribute and share it with each other. We'll talk a little bit more about permissive and copyleft, but you can remember this milestone is really like a key marker of open source licenses breaking out into the mainstream. If we skip ahead 2 years later, maybe some of you know of the Linux project that launched in 1991. This was one of the earliest open source projects and was also an early adopter of the GPL. It adopted the GPL version 2 that came out the same year. And the Linux kernel development practices have shaped a decade for the free culture movement inside of the technology world. Just to prove that point a bit, 6 years later, after the Linux project launch, we see this book that comes out in 1997. It's called The Cathedral and the Bazaar. It was really this, the book isn't as significant as what it represents, is that this international breakthrough of open source is starting to come through into the mainstream. So this book describes these two significantly different ways of doing software dev, where this cathedral model is this closed proprietary software development and a very, very procedural. And then there was this Bazaar method, which was this open and free software development. What Eric Raymond describes here as like the Linux community seemed to resemble a great babbling bazaar of differing agendas and approaches, out of which a coherent and stable system could seemingly emerge. But we have one problem in 1997, and that's when people are talking about open source, they're not saying open source at the time. They're saying free software or FOSS, free and open source software. And you know, that's fine. But maybe when you go talk to business people who in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when you say the word free about software, people get very scared and very uncomfortable when you say free. So this is why in 1998, ending our little history lesson for today, the open source initiative forms. And the OSI sort of acts as a liaison between the free culture movement and the business world. So this is the group that really coined the term open source. And their role in those early days was really convincing the business world that free doesn't mean no bottom line. And so it's around here that we start to see the term open source software really start to emerge and become more common. And today, the OSI's most significant thing they do is they actually have a legal definition of what open source means. It's the open source definition that I talked about earlier. So that's nice. You know, we went through all this history, but like, why does this really matter? You know, this was all in the 20th century. It's been a long time since a lot of these things have happened. So why does this matter? Well, the same conversations are happening today in the 2020s, just as they were in the 1980s and the 1990s. So to help us better understand that essence of what free software comes from, it's helpful to understand the 4 freedoms. You can always look at the open source definition and think about the legal definition, but I think this way is an easier way of remembering it. So we'll talk about the 4 freedoms of open source. So these are the 4 essential principles. These are the rules of open source. And these 4 freedoms are unchangeable. They're fixed, they're part of the deal, they're the name of the game. So, and this is true of whether you're working with software or content. These 4 freedoms are enshrined in any open source license. This is true for any open source license. So the first one is you have the freedom to read, maybe more relevant to software, but you have the ability to see how something works, and you can study the source code and look at it. You have the freedom to run it or use it any way you want. There's no restrictions on how you can use the software or the content. You can do it any way you want. You can also revise it, make changes. You can make changes to the software or the content and modify it. And finally, you can redistribute. You are allowed to share the unmodified or the modified source and your changes with other people. So I like to remember these as the 4 R's, the freedom to read, run, revise, redistribute. They're the foundations that we've relied on for open source since the 1980s. But, you know, that's been, if this is the core, well, how has open source changed since then? So if we're starting from the four freedoms, I mentioned, 1990s, early 2000s, the word free and open source, really scary to a lot of people. I love this quote from Microsoft in 2001, Jim Alchin, who was, I think, Senior VP of Engineering. Open source is this intellectual property destroyer. I can't imagine something worse than this for the software business and intellectual property. He does not mince his words about how he sees open source. But let's just fast forward 15 years. And wow, here's Satya Nadella in 2015 from a post that says, Microsoft officially in love with open source. Microsoft's been working with open source for 10 years. They have a love for Linux. They have 140 working groups dealing with open standards. They have over 400 projects that all where code is written before it's given back to the community. So wow, a lot can happen in 14 years. So I always love that to show just around how big the appetite has changed in open source in the last decade or 10, 20 years. Just to make this point further, this was actually before Microsoft went in even deeper on open source when they casually dropped $7.5 billion to acquire GitHub in 2018. Arguably the largest platform for where software is developed and created around the world. But hold your beverage. This was just the beginning. We'll skip ahead for one of the largest tech company acquisitions ever. I don't know if this has been topped yet, but $34 billion that IBM paid to acquire Red Hat, a company that has started and built its entire company and its mission around open source software and Linux specifically. So this was in July 2019. $34 billion that IBM spent to acquire Red Hat. So what does this all mean in the end? I think today, the general consensus is that open source has won. It's no longer a controversial add-on to collaborative work, and often it's expected. So, the attitude has changed. It's being more closely related to innovation and transparency, and more organizations, more governments, and more software development stakeholders are really considering open source very seriously. But where we get to today is it's kind of like that, the dog that chased the car and then it caught the car. It doesn't quite know what to do once it catches the car. So this taste of victory is maybe not quite what for the free software movement 40 years ago envisioned. I mean, and if you look around us in 2022, there's no digital utopia that open source has brought about, and there's still ever a lack of transparency and closed systems. But it's not all bad. It's just important to take account of the present moment. And this is just to shape our perspective for how far we've already come and maybe how far we still have to go. So we made it through the open source history lesson. Congratulations. We just went through about 40, almost 50 years of history there in just like 20 minutes. Not bad. So now I'll pause here just to check with Nathan. Do you want to run through the slides here, or do you want to present from your screen for the DPG side? How do you want to handle the DPG part for today? Do we still have Nathan on the call? Actually, looks like he may have dropped.
Justin,
Yeah.
I'll reach out to him to coordinate.
Okay, I told him that I would be able to take it if he had connection challenges. So I can go ahead and dive into it here. So around digital public goods. So this is we're going to take things in a different perspective. We're going to go from all the historical history piece that we just looked at and take a much more contemporary view. We talked about standards as a way to benchmark and to build more stability around what you're doing. And this is one way that we do that around open source. So before I go into the details of what are DPGs and the people behind that, I want to tell you a story. So you might remember those early times of the before times in January 2020, before the pandemic was really all off and going. So in actually, try to remember your team is based in one of the teams is based in Sri Lanka, right?
Yes, Tilly.
Oh, well,
Yes.
yeah, this will be a very personal example. So in Sri Lanka, the first suspected case of coronavirus was registered on January 27th on 2020. Immediately, local developers got to work building a COVID-19 tracker for a software called DHIS2. It's an open source health information management system and also a digital public good being used by Sri Lanka. Globally, DHIS2, it's used in 73 countries, which account for 30% of the world's population. So their COVID-19 tracker focused on the registration and tracking of travelers arriving from regions with a high risk of COVID infection. It was created within 2 days of that first registered COVID case, and it was deployed at Sri Lanka's airports just days later. But the speed and efficiency at which Sri Lanka was able to respond to the crisis was actually not the most impressive part of the story. The most impressive part is how quickly this innovation was able to be picked up and adapted by other countries. So after developing their COVID tracker, Sri Lanka shared their user guides with the global DHIS2 COVID-19 response team, and they shared those as openly licensed training materials. And because DHIS2 is open source and used in 73 countries worldwide, their user guides were communicated quickly among the global community. Excuse me. And the tracker is now operational in 38 countries and being adapted for use in 14 more. So really kind of incredible case study. We were talking about like making things more accessible and more visibility. You know, I think this is a really great example of that, especially, what made that possible? What made that growth and sharing out so successful? On one hand, it was, open licenses, that there was a legal framework that existed and was in place for how these things are shared and how people can reuse and work with them. There also was community. It was with DHIS2, which is a huge open source project and has ties in many different places. And then it also finally addressed a really critical global need. So this is a great example of an innovation solving big problems, and it wasn't a coincidence. And this is because the way the technology was designed and developed that set it up for this kind of success. So that brings us to digital public goods. The group behind digital public goods is called the DPG Alliance. They call these kinds of technologies that I just talked about here with Sri Lanka as digital public goods. What are DPGs, or digital public goods? They are open source technologies or content that can include software, data, standards, AI models, written content that have been built to adhere to relevant best practices, that do no harm, and advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So these are the goods that we believe need to be identified, recognized, and supported because of their capacity to help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. If we look back again at 2020, this idea isn't that new, but there's been a growing focus on this idea of DPGs, largely driven by our recognition that the process of digital transformation needs effective, adoptable, open tools. In 2019, the high-level panel on digital cooperation, the UN Secretary General, recognized the potential of DPGs to reduce fragmentation and duplication, saying that everyone in the UN, member states, United Nations systems, the private sector, and other stakeholders should promote open source, especially those that adhere to privacy and other applicable international and domestic laws and best practices. And so you see this recommendation here in his roadmap for digital cooperation. And this is what actually led to the creation of the DPG Alliance and the creation of the standard, which we'll talk about in just a second. So at a high level, at the heart of all digital public goods, there are really three components you have to remember. Is that one, they are projects that advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Two, they are open source and have clear definitions of copyright and trademark. And lastly, three, they do no harm. So how do you measure these things? This is one of the core parts of what the DPG Alliance does, is that they have created and maintained the DPG standard, which is a set of 9 indicators that create a baseline of requirements that must be met in order to earn that recognition as a DPG. So solutions have to enable that kind of open innovation we talked about in the first story. And that means using open licenses, but it also means having good documentation, data that is accessible, and being committed to following standards and best practices, as well as keeping in line with privacy and security law and other components of doing no harm. And the full standard is linked out on the website, but going forward, as you start to work with your different mentors, this will be something that each mentor might approach this, the DPG standard in a different way during their mentorship. For example, in the open source mentorship, we'll talk a lot more about 2 and 3, about using approved open licenses and clear ownership. On the software development mentorship, you'll probably spend a lot more time talking about number 4 and number 8, platform independence, making sure that your solution isn't tied to any proprietary or licensed tools, or making sure that you're following those standards and best practices. So how do you actually become a DPG? What is the process? And again, we'll follow 3 steps here to become a certified DPG that's shown on the registry and gets connected to governments and NGOs all around the world that are working to launch new technology in places where internet connectivity hasn't been before. So in that process, to get to that point, that end of the tunnel, first you have to nominate. You have to be nominated either by a product owner or just someone who has a good understanding of the design and the development of the product. So you go through a nomination form and you submit the form. Then you'll go through a technical review process that you'll have a team from the DPG Alliance that reviews your submission, both as the nominee, which is a little lower barrier, and then as the full certification, which is a more rigorous review. But you'll go through that process. There'll be a feedback loop. You might hear from the team if they have follow-up questions. And then finally, if you make it through the technical review, everything is clarified and you're in line with the standard, you achieve certification and you'll be recognized as a DPG on the registry. And just to give you an idea of what's out there in the DPG registry today, this chart is a little out of date because there's actually 89 solutions that are now recognized as digital public goods. I think there's almost 700 nominees now, but you can see at the time the screenshot was taken, most of the DPGs are software, followed by content and data being the next biggest groups, and then the smallest group being standards. And across all the DPGs and the nominees, you can see how they're spread out across the different sustainable development goals. So you can find this all on the DPG registry website, and you can also get these links in the slides and the notes after today, which will be shared after the call. So now I just want to circle back around. I mentioned a little bit that there's the Digital Public Goods Alliance, the DPGA, but I want to talk a little bit more about this group that's really behind the moving energy behind DPGs. And the goal of an equitable world is at the core of the DPG Alliance and the work they do to identify and promote DPGs. To give you an idea about the Alliance, it's a multi-stakeholder group. It was launched in 2019 to really accelerate the attainment of the SDGs in low and middle income countries. The original founding members of the DPGA were UNICEF, the government of Norway, the government of Sierra Leone, and iSpirit, a think tank based out of India. The DPGA has a mission to accelerate the attainment of by facilitating the discovery, development, use of, and investment in DPGs. Today, the DPGA has expanded its membership to include a growing list of organizations that are also committed to that shared vision. In the last few months, the German Ministry for Development, the BMZ, UNDP, the Office of the Envoy on Technology, and GitHub have recently joined as members of the Alliance. So that's great and all that the Alliance is there and doing these things, but why does it exist? What's its function? Really, we can frame that around 3 different pieces. Is that one, to maintain access to quality, openly licensed, adaptable, and deployable DPGs, or the registry. To transform the complex systems and structures and practices in which DPGs are embedded, modernizing digital infrastructure and technology. And finally, to mobilize the DPG ecosystem to sustainably fund and support DPGs. So making sure that once projects achieve DPG certification, they can connect and have resources, and that there's a pathway to continue supporting projects even after they achieve certification. So that's a little bit on the why. Finally, I just want to wrap up here by looking at what are the advantages of being certified. I mentioned that in the DPG registry, those projects actually get flagged and highlighted to all these different governments and NGOs, international partners who are building out infrastructure and technology. This ties into some other work that UNICEF is doing related to GIGA. GIGA is in an effort to connect all of the world's schools to the internet by 2030, which is a huge effort, but we have a lot of work going on that front. But one of the questions that comes out of that work is, okay, great, you're working with people to create new connectivity infrastructure, like laying fiber lines and building connectivity infrastructure. So these places that have not been connected to the internet before are now being connected. What do you do after that? Does Microsoft just roll in with their proprietary service agreements and all their software and dominate the scene? Well, ideally, no, that's not what we want. So DPGs are one part and answer to that work with GIGA, thinking about with these new places and schools and governments and cities that are being connected to the internet for the first time. How can you make sure that equitable technology is being created and developed for these places and for these regions? So that's one part of, thinking about how this work ties into what UNICEF is doing. Is it's a really huge part of this internet connectivity work that we're doing. But there's also the other parts written here on the slide too, like discoverability, which I guess is part of what I was mentioning. But even beyond like the government or NGO perspective, you'll get more visibility into your work, that it's following a known and reputable standard. It builds more stability behind what you're doing. And it also makes sure that you have broad recognition that the project is open source, it's adaptable, and it aligns to the SDGs. You also hit support for usability. The DPG Alliance convenes a few communities of practice that assess the DPGs against other kinds of criteria. They'll share feedback and also other input that enhances usability of a DPG. And there's also technical and financial support to continue growing DPGs, ranging from mentorship to financial funding opportunities. It's a couple of different directions there. And then lastly, one other key advantage is the deployment capacity, is that Pathfinder countries work with the Alliance to also adapt applicable solutions to scale through their national systems. So people who are coming on board to deploy the technology are also committed partners to that as well, and building that capacity to work with the software. So just to come back to that nomination process here before we switch over directions, anyone can submit the nomination form online. You can learn a little bit more about the nomination process as well, but this is just the high-level details on what are DPGs, what is the DPG Alliance, and a little bit on what the standard is. So over the next few months in your mentorship, we'll go deeper on all of these different parts, different ways with different mentors, but you'll be hearing the DPG standard come up a good bit and how that ties into the work that you're doing as part of your work plans with the Venture Fund. Okay, so that was a lot of me talking. I just want to pause here. The next thing that we'll be talking about is sustainable business models for open source, but I just want to check and see if there's any questions on all that open source history or on the digital public goods side. If you have any questions or comments, now is a good time.
One quick question, Justin, is so DPG, looks like DPG is backed by the UN in a big way, along with some other entities like the Norwegian government. So I guess I'm answering my question myself. The second thing is, so if that's the case, if we, as different startups here, uh, journey through the process and we get to a place where we can get ourselves certified as a DPG, you did mention that that would facilitate us to re-engage more with the venture fund and other entities that can further our journey as an enterprise, right?
Correct. So there's things from the DPG Alliance, from those communities of practice. Sometimes there's participants there that are more connected to certain funding opportunities that might make sense for certain DPGs. But also with the UNICEF Venture Fund, we recently started to explore growth funding modalities, of which being compliant with the DPG standard is a huge part for the eligibility for follow-on funding. So that's something that we're starting to explore a little bit more, and maybe Megan could comment on it a little bit more towards the end if you have more questions. But yeah, there are more funding opportunities that can become available for you once you achieve certification as well.
Thanks, Justin.
Sure. Any other questions or comments before we go to the final leg of today's webinar? Going once, going twice.
Justin, just pointing out, everyone, I'm putting an article in the chat, which references the Venture Fund's follow-on funding opportunity. But happy to answer more questions on the back of that.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Megan. All right, so let's go ahead and move into the final part of today's presentation. So this one, we've talked a lot about kind of the more theoretical, kind of more conceptual parts of open source, but let's think more around the business sides, really getting specific on what kinds of sustainable business models exist for open source. So we're going to talk first. I'm going to come back to that licensing topic a little bit, talk about threats and benefits to the open source approach, excuse me, and then finally I'll share some more concrete approaches and some examples of how other companies and projects have approached this same dilemma as well. So starting with the licensing piece, I mentioned that there's two main licensing strategies, and this is true of software, of hardware, of content, of data. You will find two kinds of open source licenses, permissive and copyleft. Now, we're going to have a deeper conversation about this in the first open source mentorship call, but just to give you a very brief summary here, permissive licenses are very permissive. They allow people to do, you always have those 4 freedoms we talked about, but they can decide to relicense the work under something else. They can mix the open source, the permissive code with other open source code, but also other proprietary code. People don't necessarily have to share their changes and improvements back to the original project. Whereas copyleft licenses, like the GPL license I talked about during the open source intro, the big thing about copyleft licenses generally is that they have this special clause that says, and if you're using this work in a derivative or mixing any of this copyrighted code with other projects, well, you have to follow the same or a compatible license, which by extension means you basically can't close source copyleft code. It has some protections in place where those 4 freedoms, whereas a permissive license can choose to discard those 4 freedoms if you don't want to do an open source approach. Copyleft really enshrines those 4 freedoms, and it makes those 4 freedoms part of the deal when you work with any kind of open source work licensed under a copyleft license. If you're a little confused on what that looks like, that's okay. This is just to give you a quick summary of it, but if you have deeper questions on the licensing piece, we'll definitely cover that in the first mentorship. But it's an important part of when you think about sustainable business models. It's part of how you present your work and put it out there and what legal framework you're operating within. So this takes us into the threats and benefits parts of open source. So let's start with the threats, the risks. So one is that someone can take your stuff They can see the secret sauce. They can get the details of how you're doing what you're doing. Another risk is that someone can make what you're making better, or they can make it cheaper. And lastly, they could take the work that you're doing and try to go after a different market than what you're going for. On the benefits, on the positive sides, again, someone can take your stuff. That can be, it goes both ways. That can, if you're not prepared for it, that can be a threat. But if you optimize and really think about that as a benefit, that can also be a really good thing when people are taking your stuff and doing other things with it. I always like to mention that a rising tide lifts all the boats. I'm sure Elon Musk and Tesla's is a well-known name, but a couple of years back, Tesla released their battery patents as open. They didn't put any patent enforcements on their battery patents, so that the industry as a whole could do better on electric car batteries. Another benefit is that it also allows you to be agile with innovation. Working with open source, it's easier to be disruptive by responding quickly to changing requirements. And finally, you just spend, in general, much less time, effort, resources on patents, on litigation, and building all these different custom software and hardware components. One case study I like to mention for this, or on the hardware innovation front, is Arduino. Maybe you're familiar with it. Arduino are these little tiny little breadboard computers. People use them for very basic programming, like a microcontroller. But the whole design for an Arduino, this is actually open source hardware. You can find the schematics and the specs for how you actually build these, and how manufacturers would how they approach building these little pieces. So you can actually build your own Arduino if you have the right parts and the expertise. And even though they've shared all their secrets out there in the open, that's actually made them the craze for Arduino even bigger, because everything's open. There's common standards that exist for how these things work. People can build on them and adapt, and they're interoperable with other tools. And they also use open source tools for working around the hardware. It's always a favorite example of mine that I like to mention. But now let's go ahead and switch over to the approaches part of this part of today's presentation. So before we talk about some of I think it's 7 or 8 approaches I'll share with you before we go, I just want to start with a question. Do you want to charge for your base product? In some cases, maybe you're familiar with the concept of a loss leader. So someone who loses a little bit in one area, but uses that as a way to strategically gain in some other part of their business model or in their product. The retail industry has been giving away things since there were stores. And I think mobile video games can also be a really great example, that most of them are all free, but some of them still make millions or even billions of dollars just in other ways of monetizing what they're doing. So if you do decide to give away the base product for free, we'll talk about 7 different models of what you can sell around your open source product. And we'll look at a lot of these will feature Red Hat as an example for some of these. So we'll start first with enterprise or targeted versions. So common characteristics of these might be, you have a version of your application or your system that has different features, or it's optimized more efficiently, or it has more flexibility for how you use it. Red Hat Enterprise Linux, which is Red Hat's primarily commercial offering, is probably the best example of this. It's a Linux distribution, which by extent has to be free and open source because of that copyleft license that Linux has been using since 1991. So Red Hat Enterprise Linux is also all free and open source, but you can get the subscription and the enterprise version, which gives you access to different kinds of software. Things are better configured and set up, so it's more efficient and better performance than just compiling it yourself or using an off-the-shelf Linux distro. You can also look at services around your product. Red Hat, again, is a really excellent example of this, especially with how they do customer and user support. So generally services that could look like consulting, it can be customization or providing other kinds of guidance or tools around your work. Red Hat has always been really big on this with their support arm of their business, which is really what they built their company off of. And being able to work with customers to help tailor and build and change the open source technology in ways that fit the customer's needs. So services can be around your product, but services can also be your product. You can also sell services with an open source product as your service delivery method. Red Hat's OpenShift is another good example of this. That's like, if you're, some of you might be familiar with Kubernetes, I think. OpenShift is like a more customized Kubernetes, but Red Hat does this by, they actually have a whole thing with Amazon, Red Hat and Amazon, where you can run Red Hat's OpenShift on AWS, and you can get certified for doing that on AWS. And Amazon and Red Hat will both like recognize your certification for that side of things. So that's one more example. On the content side, so usually we see this around, it can be games, but also different kinds of content. You can have different chapters or certain content that you have to unlock or gain in other ways. You can have levels, like in the game side of things, having different levels that you unlock or that you buy or download. On the packaging front, this could look like having compiled versions or pre-configured versions of your software. It could be having a bundle, working on bundling your software with something else that's useful, or integrating it with another useful tool or third-party solution. So just thinking about how you package and present your open source product and how you present its value proposition. And also, lastly, training. Training is another really great way of how to monetize your business model around using the technology itself. And you can have certifications around the technology. Red Hat is also an example of this as well. They have a learning subscription. You can take courses with Red Hat, get certified in using their technology, get that on your LinkedIn, and it helps you in job interviews and building your technical skills using Red Hat's technology. There's also an example of a venture fund team that's done this as well that just came to mind. They were doing work with drones, and they were having to train people on how to operate drones or use some of the software for controlling drones. And so they would do training with some of their users, which were often government employees who were administrating the airspaces on how to do these things. So these are just 7 approaches that exist out there. You're not limited to these 7 approaches. There's certainly more ways of doing it, but these are some of the most common and proven ways of going about it. But you can always ask, are there things you could be doing? Do those of you that primarily sell services, do you want to think about adding training or certification to your packages? Can you stratify your product offering for different levels of users? Or do you want to resell or have a referral service for some of the things you're doing? These are all good questions to be asking. So this is just to give you an idea of something to think about as we get ready to start the open source mentorship calls, really thinking out what your open advantage is. But that brings us, with that, we're getting to the end of today's presentation. I just want to give a quick preview because we have our next one tomorrow. It'll be much shorter, much more quick and to the point. We'll dive into the details of what this mentorship modality will look like, of how we're going to collaborate and work together for the next few months. So that'll be what we go into tomorrow, just talking about what is the mentorship, what is the structure, how will we work together. So come ready for that one tomorrow. But that's all that we have. We made it to the end. So we got through 40 years of open source history. We talked about digital public goods. We talked about what your open source advantage is. And all of these things will be topics we start to go into with the mentorship you'll receive from the Venture Fund. So you can find my contact up here, as well as some links of resources to look at in the meantime. But I'll be happy to take any questions or comments or concerns, anything that's on your mind around open source before we look at wrapping up.
This is Vidya. I just want to say this was super useful. And I especially loved learning about the history of open source because it really sort of anchors us, you know, in like the origins of open source. And it's really meaningful. So thank you for taking us through all of that.
This is Ravi. Thanks, Justin. For me, it was a walk down memory lane. I've been doing this since 1985. So much of what you went through and kind of described, it kind of was, if I had hair, it would be sticking from the top of my head, in the sense that there's so much energy there that we've all been through on this planet regarding software and hardware. So thanks for this presentation.
Absolutely. Glad it was helpful.
Yeah, on our end too, I think that there's some things that there's still lots of questions, but very to the point. So maybe we can take it on to with our mentorship calls. But yeah, it's got my mind thinking about what we can do. And one question, I think it's obvious, but since we're very, very new to this, is that what you're saying with the business models is that in some cases it doesn't have to be an open source full, like the company our product doesn't have to be full open source. It just can have components of open source, and others can be licensed or licensed, not copyrighted, right? For example, when you say that you can do levels, so some levels can be free and others can be paid or with a subscription. That means that the ones that are with a subscription have to be, they can have intellectual property rights, right?